hopefully I can contribute some additional Generation X point of view on this. And this title has changed a bit from what I had originally, where it was more the field, from the field to the classroom, because really that premise still holds true, but what kind of informs my course design is experiences that I had in the field. And that primarily started at the Institute for Advanced Technology and the Humanities at the University of Virginia. And I was there for about 5 years, and that's a research institute. And what we were doing was collaborating with faculty, but then also people who were working in computer science, social scientists, and humanists. And at the time, the director was a classicist, and so he was really interested in sculpture. So we started working out by scanning some plaster casts, but then also original marble. So this is at the Vatican Museums, and we were collaborating with them. And this was in 2008 or 2009 that we were working on this project. And again, we were looking at, we had already been doing some virtual reconstructions of historic sites. Now we were thinking about ways that we can begin to populate these models. And there were a number of questions that we were attempting to answer with this particular project. What one really was is that, as most of you are aware, that what you're scanning can be affected by the material. And so here we're looking at a plaster reproduction and then also the original marble. With marble, you get a lot of noise dependent with subsurface scattering that can occur. You get a bit better result in terms of scanning the plaster. Question is what would return a better metric data? We knew we were getting more information returned from the plaster, but which one would be a bit more accurate? And you guys have seen some various scanners, I think, throughout the past couple days. If you're not aware, this is the Breukman structured light scanner. Operates a bit differently than some of the phase-based scanners that you've been looking at. This operates using light, projected light, but then also a camera. So light's being projected in a pattern. The distortions in those patterns are assessed, and that's how you're beginning to collect your metric information. What we found, or at least during the day we were scanning in the conservation lab, and then at night after visitors had left, we were scanning the marbles, the original marble. And there's the result that we had. And what we were kind of finding with this is that although we were getting a bit of noise in the data, it was still returning better results with the marble because the plaster was actually shrinking and so condensing, so we were getting better information from that. Another project, this is continuing to look at scanning of sculpture, and I enjoyed this project for a number of reasons. One is I was learning more about curatorial and how museums are working, ways and the relationships between some of these interpretations. For instance, the one on the right from the early 20th century, how those same concepts apply from a preservation standpoint and decisions that are made within the restoration process, how those changes shift over time and how ideas change as well. So this is on the right, a late 20th century interpretation from curatorial, but as you know, most of the time you're finding these in fragments and then you're putting them back together. Some interpretation has to be made. So the idea was, okay, can we provide them with a model that they would be able to manipulate on their own to come up with multiple interpretations without affecting the 20th century or the late 20th century interpretation, which could be argued as historic at this point, and whether or not you would really want to alter it. Again, just to kind of introduce at this point, this I think was in about 2008 or 9 too, so they're kind of around the same time, but we're using the ferro arm. So again, just trying to introduce some different scanning techniques and really to think about how you're using different scanners depending on the scale. So you shouldn't really be employing the same scanner. It really depends on what objects and at what scale you're going to be documenting. Also too, as I mentioned, a lot of what we were doing was three-dimensional reconstructions. That's kind of how I got started in this. Again, being Generation X, I was sort of kind of raised in the video game generation, and this was one way for me to kind of begin to employ some of those interests as well. And this was a collaboration with Colonial Williamsburg and recreating Williamsburg at 1776. Again, this sort of same premise of where Williamsburg was restored in the 1930s, an argument could be made that that interpretation is considered historic at this point. And so architectural historians, though, wanted to begin to alter that. And we were talking with them about ways that you could begin to maybe correct mistakes from the past using digital technologies and digital techniques. This is also before BIM became a bit more popular and easier to use. So we were looking at this as working with curatorial architectural historians, a way to access their database. So this was being put in Unity at the time. It was a real-time model. You'd be able to interact with it and click on objects that would then be accessed, information from their database. That's available on their website, so you can kind of check that out at Colonial Williamsburg. And again, working with curatorial, we wanted to be able to populate the model, but we were hand modeling, when I say hand modeling, but with software at the time. And now we wanted to think about, okay, well, how do we begin to get some of these objects into the model? Some of the issues, though, that we were having is that none of us were, I think, skilled enough to be able to model a bust or to model a person's face, and so we were looking at laser scanning as a way to bring those objects into a real-time model. Again, we're employing the Next engine, a different type of scanner, optical triangulation scanner, inexpensive. But the things that we were trying to figure out at this point, we had to think about the density of the mesh, which would have an impact in terms of real-time visualization. So we had to figure out how do we begin to retopologize, some of these things. And these are issues that are coming up, though, within creation of video games today, because I'm talking with faculty from game design about ways that they can begin to integrate scan data and also structure from motion information into games. Now I kind of want to talk about more some of the consulting that I've done. So this is outside of UVA. So these were things that I was doing on my own. This is Prince Frederick's Battery. So it's also part of the national park. It's just off of the island of St. Thomas. And this was a fort that was constructed in the early 1800s. And what they were interested in was developing a stabilization report, doing documentation, and then also coming up with a reconstruction of this, because they're never going to actually do that. I thought on the right-hand side, you can see, or at least hopefully you can maybe make out, there's a lot of cords and cables. Maybe you can't see. Maybe it's just you see this red and blue. But the thing is that I'm like tethered to a million things at this point, because this is back in 2010. The Faro Focus had just been, I think, released. Didn't have access to it, so I'm using a surphaser, which is another phase-based scanner. But then we had to drag a generator on the island, which was a complete, it was a pain. It was difficult, but well worth it. Here's sort of some of just the registered point clouds, but then coming up with this sort of virtual restoration or this reconstruction. Again, one of the things that I think was touched on yesterday that really important to me is a way that we begin to repurpose this information. So I'm also really interested in public history, public humanities. So I'm constantly thinking, and we talk about the expense of these things, not only cost-wise, but time-wise, how do we repurpose this information? So I think that should be something that we're always kind of thinking about in the back of our minds. And then finally, one last, at least, consulting project. This is one that's current, and I'm collaborating with the Carnegie Museum on documenting their Hall of Architecture, which, if you haven't been, is pretty amazing. They have these architectural casts. And what they're trying to think about is how can they activate this space. They're trying to get more people involved. One of those aspects was thinking about ways that they can integrate digital technology as a way of engaging the public. Also ways of people that can research and study these things remotely. So there I've employed structure from motion, which is creation of 3D models through photographs, but then also laser scanning, so combining those two. And I wanted to talk about that because, like I said, those experiences really inform what I then bring into the classroom and technologies that I decide to focus on within that experience. So again, this structure from motion, 3D modeling, laser scanning, GIS, web design. The course, there's an undergraduate, but then also a graduate level course. Just to kind of give context, classes are 2.5 hours long. We work on the quarter system, so they meet twice a week over a period of 10 weeks. As I also mentioned, I wanted to kind of base this on thinking about pedagogy and what sort of theories are out there. For that, I ended up choosing like a project-based pedagogy because one, both digital humanities as well as preservation, we're primarily working on projects, and both are about interdisciplinary. So we're constantly working in teams, and we're working with people from different professions. So some of the other things is that this idea of those tenets is that, real world scenario. So I wanted to create a situation that would reflect what my students would be experiencing in the real world. I also want them to be working with the technologies that we all are at this point. I want them to be prepared when they're out there. Collaborative, as I mentioned, it's interdisciplinary, so they should be working with others, but also as a way of reinforcing what they're learning, ways that they can begin to talk and discuss, have discussions with each other. Providing some sort of student ownership. I mean, I think we all know that the more invested they are in the project, the better that they're going to do. So I think that's really important. Analysis and reflection, thinking that, they need to, have ways that, they can begin to get critiques and opportunities to, reflect upon what they're doing. And then updates and feedback, that's really my responsibility. What sort of grading opportunities am I providing that will provide feedback along the way? And then presentation and critique. One of the things that I expect is that at the end of the quarter that they're going to be presenting to their peers as well as professionals and other groups that they might be working with. So these are sort of the tenets that I was kind of basing this design around. So what I want to do now is at least talk about projects that were integrated into the course that kind of reflect some of these different tenets. And the first one is this idea of digital reconstructions of historic sites and ways that can promote student ownership. This is Old Sheldon Church. It's in South Carolina. It was constructed in 1751. It was destroyed during the Revolutionary War. It was then reconstructed in 1820s and destroyed again during the Civil War. So it just stands as a ruin. And so took students out on site, and we went ahead and we were collecting information using various forms. So traditional analog methods, so they're out there with a tape measure. We're also incorporating laser scanning and structure from motion. Those students are then processing that data. It's being reverse engineered, creating architectural drawings, but then they're developing these three-dimensional reconstructions. So this was back in 2012. Again, sort of like what some of the kind of discussions were with the previous talk. These students are coming in from all various backgrounds. Again, they're undergrad, graduate, and they might not have most of them don't really have experience using any of this sort of technology. So something accessible like SketchUp, I think works pretty well. But in terms of student ownership, they're responsible for coming up and being able to defend this interpretation. So I guided them with providing suggestions of period churches that they should go out and take a look at as they're making these design decisions. But any sort of alterations or designs that they're architectural features that they're getting from different churches, they need to sort of be able to defend why they incorporated them here at this structure. In terms of update and feedback, there's a number of projects in terms of historic cemetery documentation that I created a number of grading opportunities. One is laser scanning, so they're scanning these sites. Again, they're also employing structure from motion to get three-dimensional models of markers, headstones, and then they're incorporating this information into a GIS database. They're surveying using traditional forms as well, so the State of Georgia Historic Resource Cemetery Survey forms. So they're filling those out for each and every one of the headstones. And then that information is being all tied together in a database that's queryable. Collaboration, I think historic site documentation kind of satisfies that. This is Old Fort Jackson, which is just outside of Savannah, another fort that was constructed in the early 1800s. Collaborative, in a sense, is that they're responsible for getting together and figuring out where the site locations in terms of scanner locations, where those positions should be. They're also instructing each other on the actual use of the Faro focus. I tell one student, and it sort of becomes this chain reaction of that they're instructing the next student, and then that student's responsible for telling the other student how to use it. There was, this incorporated drone technology as well with this project, and it was actually another student's drone that we ended up using, and he was nice enough to bring that on-site and instruct students on how to use that as well. But what I like about these types of projects is really what we need to do at this point is figure out processes, comparing processes. I need to get these students to sort of understand how and when it's appropriate to use a drone. When should you be using a laser scanner? How can you begin to combine this information? So they should be thinking about that. And when you're collecting data in sort of multiple mediums, I mean, you can begin to generate those discussions. This one, real world scenario, sort of more object documentation. This kind of plays back into this relationship and the work that I'm doing with the Carnegie. But we just ended up getting a next engine scanner in the department maybe this year. So in terms of real world scenario, it's a little off because they're kind of bringing in their own objects at this point just to begin to work with that. But next week, with this class that I'm running now, we're actually going to be working with the Telfair Museum to document some of their objects. But again, this is a way of uploading this information and making it available, because now they're putting them on Sketchfab. So if you're aware of what Sketchfab is and ways that you can make your models available online, students are doing that. Then this analysis and reflection. I'm currently working with a student as a way of a comparative study for plaster restoration, looking at traditional methods. So she's employing both. This is her where she's mixing plaster, and she's going to be making the molds as well. And so what we want to do is kind of do a comparative study between using digital but as well as traditional methods. The idea is that, okay, maybe we can discern which one's better, but maybe neither are better. Maybe there's some sort of hybridized approach that we haven't thought about. So we want to take a look at that. And finally, this sort of presentation and critique. Initially, what I had when I started designing this course, I had students creating posters, much like you would see at an academic conference such as this. But then I was like, oh no, okay, I just want this to all be digital. So what they're responsible for now is making a site using WordPress. So that's the one I'm most familiar with. And then if they don't want to use that, they can use whatever they're interested in, but I can't help them after that for the most part. I probably could, but still, the idea is then that they're submitting everything digitally. And so I just end up looking at their site. And they're able to upload images, video. They're also able to embed their projects, their 3D models and things like that. But I'm really interested in making sure that they're articulating the process, methodology, results, because I want them to be able to understand what they're doing. I guess finally, sort of to end this, this kind of is a way for me to begin to assess, what they're doing. So beyond just the grade, I wanted to kind of think about ways that I could improve this class. And I really just started with this assessment this quarter. And it's 21 questions, but I wanted to kind of provide just some general questions of things that I asked them in the beginning. It's this rating from about 1 to 5. And 1 sort of being, pretty much comfortable with this technology and being, and 5, or 1 uncomfortable, 5 being, pretty comfortable with it. And so some of these things that are based on, again, this project-based pedagogy, which is, I consider myself a non-dependent and self-directed person. I'm able to learn how to use new software and hardware. I'm able to communicate my research using digital tools. I understand how laser scanning technology is utilized to document historic sites, structures, and objects, and I'm confident in my ability to discuss laser scanning technology with my peers. So the class has 8 students in it this quarter, and lowest was 2.85, 4.4 was the highest, average was 3.4. I was a bit surprised about that. I really sort of expected it to be between the 2 and the 3 range, which makes me start thinking that I have to sort of reassess the questions that I'm asking. But the one positive that I did really get out of it was that the question of, I understand how laser scanning technology is utilized, some students were answering like 3s and 4s, which I thought was pretty high. What was more revealing was the next one, which was, I'm confident in my ability to discuss scanning with my peers. That was low. And so I knew there that I was getting better results in return from that. That was more like 1s and 2s. So I think that is a bit more revealing. So thank you.